Welcome to Crossroads. There are growing signs of discontent, let's say, in the relationship between Russia and the Chinese Communist Party. Now, the two countries, they signed a no-limits agreement around the war in Ukraine, and they're moving to create a new security alliance. It's kind of similar to NATO. But the CCP seems to have some concerns. Russia is playing the subordinate in this relationship, and as the two move forward, old tensions over who's in charge seem to be emerging. But first, let's talk about the emerging kind of alliance they have. This is Foreign Policy 2023. It said the increasingly close relationship between China and Russia has been decades in the making, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine has tightened their embrace. Both countries made a clear strategic choice to prioritize relations with each other, given what they perceive as a common threat from the U.S.-led West. The deepening of bilateral ties is accompanied by a joint push for global realignment as the two countries use non-Western multilateral institutions, such as the BRICS Forum and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to expand their influence in the developing world. Now, since then, they've moved to establish their own rival to NATO through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, just recently, in fact. They're pushing for trade agreements among the member states throughout Eurasia mostly, as well as a new security alliance, the one's being compared to NATO. Now, as we've discussed before, when NATO also recently declared the Chinese Communist Party as the enabler of Russia in its war with Ukraine, the Chinese Communist Party responded to that criticism in the meetings by holding military exercises in Belarus right on the border of Ukraine and Poland, sending, of course, a direct message to NATO during a time when the CCP is being blamed for involvement in that. Then the joint, CCP and Russia military exercises held just after that in the South China Sea. And that was, of course, taken by many to suggest that the alliance goes both ways. Not only would the Chinese Communist Party back Russia in Ukraine, again, in the military exercises in Belarus were a clear sign of that, but Russia could back the CCP in a possible invasion of Taiwan. And of course, the reference of them being in the South China Sea holding military exercises was taken as a reference to that. Now, there's actually something more to this, though, something very important. Remember the assessment on the CCP being the enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine is that Russia would not be able to keep the war going without the aid of the CCP. That's the very nature of the idea that the CCP is the enabler. You remove the enabler, well, what happens to it? This suggests that Russia may not have the power that it used to have, and that it could have already been forced to a negotiating table if the Chinese Communist Party were not playing that role. So what's the way of doing with it, right? Well, as a way of dealing with this, of getting rid of the enabler, so to speak, the United States is about to hit China with sanctions. And even, of course, NATO allies are considering the same. Sanctions that could possibly even hit the Chinese banks. And that would be at a time, of course, when China, right now as we speak, they could not afford that. The Chinese Communist Party is facing a banking crisis. They're having an issue, of course, where debt is finally catching up with them. One of the main models of the CCP's economy for a long time has been mega projects, building huge ghost cities, places nobody lives, building freeways to nowhere, building airports in the middle of nowhere. Nobody uses them. They don't make money, but what they did was they took out huge bank loans, and the local governments did these mega projects with the hope that it would flow money within the economy. Eventually, the thing didn't make any money. The loans are still there, the debt builds up. The banks, of course, dealt with the breadth of that, and they're now at the breaking point. If they get sanctioned at this time, it will be devastating to the Chinese economy. But even aside from the banks, the Chinese Communist Party is facing an economic crisis on many other fronts. And all of these are likewise facing pressure both inside China and abroad. So the question is this. If Russia needs the CCP in order to keep the war going, if that continued aid depends on the CCP having the economic capacity to pay for it and keep the war going, and if the new target of the United States and NATO is to now remove that economic factor, to sanction the CCP to the degree that it can no longer play the role of enabling Russia in its war, if that goes away, then what benefit is there for Russia to have that alliance? Well, look, on Russia's side, what they get from the CCP is the support of the Chinese economic system. On the CCP side, well, the CCP wants Russia as a building block for this imagined new world order, right? The multipolar world order with the China model at the forefront. That's what they're talking about. And that vision is quickly fading because the CCP is facing the reality that its influence through money is starting to disappear. And then, of course, there's also the possible political shifts taking place in the United States. Look, on the Republican side, for example, including with former President Donald Trump's running mate J.D. Vance, there's a push to shift defense focus from Russia to China. And we can actually see this shift already happening to an extent, including, for example, with NATO now regarding the CCP as the hand pulling the strings. The CCP is the force behind the scenes making it rain, right? So the real questions are, would Russia still choose the CCP and its tightening access to the world that it's facing if it stays with it, if the war in Ukraine were no longer there? Would it still align itself with the CCP if the main thing that the Chinese Communist Party has to offer, economic power and an alternative financial system outside the US dollar, and therefore outside US sanctions, if that just goes away? What happens if the incentives in the alliance for Russia are removed? Well, that's where we're at now. And it seems right now there are signs the relationship is actually already on shaky grounds. It's a bit of a one-sided toxic relationship, with the Chinese Communist Party very heavily focused on its own needs in ways that actually go against Russia's interests in many, many regards. Things that take advantage of Russia, things that are overriding Russia's trade partnerships and so on. Russia is becoming subservient to the CCP in this relationship. Wall Street Journal says that in Central Asia, which Moscow regards as its backyard, the friendship that both have declared as having no limits, again, Russia and China, is colliding with Beijing's global ambitions. It notes that China has seized on the Ukrainian vision to chip away at traditional Russian spheres of influence. It notes that in Central Asia, as in the Arctic, which again both China and Russia are involved with, Moscow's reliance on Beijing to sustain its war machine forces it to acquiesce on the encroachments. It notes that across the strategically situated region, Beijing, the CCP, is drawing local economies into its orbit. It notes that Chinese investments are diverting the region's young workers away from Russia. A Chinese-funded railroad promises to connect it with Europe, bypassing Russian territory. Chinese renewable energy projects are helping reduce its reliance on Russian gas. And notably as well, even as Europe itself has become less reliant on Russia for energy, the CCP is also trying to sell these renewables to most of Europe. The CCP is taking away Russia's market, in other words. Now, through this relationship, Russia is finding itself increasingly isolated, not just from the West, but even from its former allies and trade partners, organizations that are now within their orbit with the CCP, but the CCP is dominating those.